Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session. And I hope as you're coming into this session, one, that you've had a good day so far at the conference, and two, if you can, and I just posted in the chat there, to put your name and your location, and if you can, one study or resource about professional learning that has impacted your practice. Just as kind of our initial icebreaker would be great. To again, put your name and your location, and also a particular area or study or resource about professional learning, since the topic of this standards lab is on research and evidence. That would be wonderful as we're getting ready to start in just a moment for this session. And so if you're able to do that, thank you, Janelle, for jumping out there quickly. And again, where you're from would be great. And we'll do that as we get started here. Get everybody up to speed. Also, send a special welcome if this is your first annual conference, first Learning Forward annual conference. And we welcome you, and we also know we have some veterans as well, and those that have experienced multiple conferences, although I guess we're all rookies in a way that this is our first virtual conference, which we've been very excited to be part of too. Yeah, thank you, Kim. So being this is your first from Colorado. Well, great. Well, you continue to think about that for, again, something that's been particularly impactful for you or in a particular area of evidence or research, we're going to go ahead and get started, and excited to turn things over to our president and CEO, Denise Glenn Borders, to do our welcome. And then I'll come back on and talk about the agenda before we launch into this session, including some outstanding panelists as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Denise.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And first and foremost, I want to welcome everyone from all of the different time zones that I know we're operating in. And I'd like to first actually introduce the other three members of the standards team, the Learning Forward Standards team. So first and foremost, Tracy Crow, who will wave to you, is our Chief of Strategy and Communications. Paul Fleming, who was just speaking, is our Senior Vice President of Standards, States, and Equity. And Elizabeth Foster is our Vice President of Research and Standards. And our standards focus for this session is research and evidence. And our three incredible panelists that we're so happy to introduce are Carol Campbell, the Associate Professor of Leadership, University of Toronto. Please give a wave, Carol. Brian Goodwin, who is the CEO of McCrell International. And Sho Cravens, Associate Dean for International Affairs, Vanderbilt University. We couldn't be more excited about coming together in this standards revision on research and evidence to hear insights from our prestigious panelists and to share with you the very first round of the Learning Forward revised standards, the draft. We have received such valuable input and guidance from our standards advisory panel, and our panelists are all a part of our Standards Advisory Council. And we've had thus far 4 meetings this year, and they have just been tremendous in moving us forward. Also very giving a great deal of guidance has been our Learning Forward board, our affiliates, our foundation, and all of our staff. First, just a few reflections. I want to tell you a little bit about the journey, how we've gotten to this point in time. The Learning Forward Standards team has been meeting every week, and sometimes several times per week since the beginning of the year, steeped in guidance from the Standards Advisory Council and all of the other stakeholders that I've mentioned earlier. And we've learned so much from everyone, and we've really recognized through our support of districts how challenging the back to school starts have been in the pandemic environment, and what educators most urgently need, and the new skills that they need to learn. We've learned so much about that. And through our weekly webinars, which actually started at the beginning of the pandemic and actually continue to this day, what we've learned from teachers and leaders have really reinforced how important it is now more than ever to ground education in the highest quality professional learning and practice, no matter the delivery, virtual or face-to-face. We've immersed ourselves in research on myriad industry and professional standards in the US and globally to ensure that we have an international perspective that meets the needs across the globe. We've been very intentional about equity being threaded throughout the standards with much greater emphasis. And we've been clear that the standards should be structured as aspirational, directional, and actionable. And we've added essential actions, exemplars, and vignettes. We're focused on coherence and committed to multiple iterations and considerations. So we really look forward to digging in today in our specific focus area of research and evidence. And we look forward to experiencing a rich discussion, your direct and honest feedback and insightful questions. So with that, Paul, I'll give it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. And again, we are so appreciative that all of you are joining us, because Denise mentioned the feedback on this first draft revised set of standards is really going to be living with all of you, and is really should be shaped by all of you and your feedback. So we're going to spend a little less than 2 hours now together. And again, we thank you for joining us. This is the fourth of our standards lab sessions on research now and evidence, and it'll be divided up into 3 sections. First, we'll give you a very quick overview of the standards revision process so far this year, including who is on our Standards Advisory Council, of which then the next piece, you'll meet 3 of the members who are on our council that also are experts in the field, recognized for their impact on, especially with research and evidence, and really merging policy and practice together. And I think that's a powerful notion for hearing from all of them. This will be very interactive, and so we ask all of you to use the chat box freely for questions and comments that then, at this point, Elizabeth will be moderating that part to help direct those questions to either one or all of the panelists. And then third, we will show and explore both an overview of the revised standards draft and actually one example standard, the culture of collaborative inquiry, and what the components are for that particular standard that are really represented, as you've seen them already, through all 10 that we are. And then finally, we'll give you an opportunity to give us quick feedback on a Padlet format about your quick take on so far your take on the standards and the revised draft, as well as mentioned the timeline of what's happening going forward towards the final draft, and the public commentary and feedback opportunity that we mentioned already that will be open until January 15th. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Tracy to talk a little bit about where we've been and what the journey has been with our professional learning standards for learning forward. So Tracy.
All right, thank you, Paul. Okay, so Paul mentioned we've been doing this session throughout the conference and taking a different focus in each one. And we really called these revision labs because we're want this to be as transparent and collaborative a process as possible, and informed by you, informed by the field, to make these standards as valuable and useful for you as they can be. You're the ones who lead the learning, and your guidance in terms of how we describe practice, provide tools to transform practice, inform policy. We really so appreciate that you're here to bring your expertise. And so I'll just share a bit of background on the standards for professional learning, sort of historically in our current version. And I appreciate that we have folks in the room who are very familiar with standards for professional learning. And I appreciate also that several of you have joined more than one of these sessions with us to experience the different conversations. So thanks so much for that. So just the basics, the standards for professional learning describe the conditions for and elements of high quality professional learning that leads to improvements in educator practice and student results. This revision in process now is leading us toward what will be the 4th version of standards. And built into their premise from the very beginning is that they reflect, to the extent possible, the current education and research landscape, because that's where you're all working. And at the same time, we know that standards must endure. This revision cycle is sort of a 10-year sort of been the pattern for us. We first released standards in 1994, 1995. Then the next version was released in 2001. And then in 2011, we published the current standards for professional learning. And those will be our standards until the next version is released. So in our current standards for professional learning, which are rolling in on the screen, have been adopted or adapted into policy in 35 states. And they are widely embraced in districts and systems across North America, across the globe, so that educators understand, plan for, evaluate, apply, experience professional learning. And we know that educators at all levels in systems use these to do that work. And as standards always have, they work in concert. So while they came in one at a time on the screen, they build a system of professional learning. And it's just integral that we work on the whole system together, recognizing those interweaving parts of that. And you'll see that reflected in the revision and process. And just, we have Learning Forward has a 50-year history in leading the field of professional learning, and every revision we do builds on the expertise, the shoulders of what came before. That's still true. And we're just so appreciative of the broad base of the deep base of expertise that we have to build on as we move toward the future. And I also want to acknowledge our funders. We appreciate so much these three funders: the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation. And it's just, we're so grateful that they recognize and commit to standards in our field, and that they know that high quality professional learning is one of the key pieces that will bring us toward equity for each and every one of our students. So we're very grateful for those funders. So Paul, we'll talk about our process a bit and our amazing Standards Advisory Council.
Thank you, Tracy. And as Denise mentioned earlier, we've convened this council now 4 different times, and we'll continue to do so on a regular basis, and really rely on this 25-member group, of which, again, you'll meet several. We've also had several join on as audience members for our different panelists, so we thank you for that, as well as members of the council who have engaged in providing feedback on this draft, including feedback on specific individual standards, which has definitely shaped the thinking. So the goal of the council is to do just that, to provide critical feedback and guidance and expertise in their own areas to help inform, as Tracy mentioned, a true systems approach for the revised draft, and to reiterate that these cannot be pulled apart individually, but to show that how they are interconnected. And so what we went after was a group of 25 that really represents multiple levels and diverse perspectives, both globally and domestically. And that includes individuals like the Montana Teacher of the Year, Linda Roust, who's actually one of the national finalists for Teacher of the Year in the United States. Includes Marlon Williams, who's a principal representing the Bronx. It's including district and state level leaders to show that level in the intersection of policy and practice. Certainly you're going to meet key researchers and university representatives today on our panel with Carol and Sho and Brian. And it also shows our council representing really national and international organizations to give that high level perspective of what is happening outside of even the US, which we hope is reflected in this first draft. So it's really been a joy, I think all of us, I would say on behalf of our internal team, to work with the council thus far in terms of how much they pushed and shaped our thinking for the creation of this first draft set of standards, and I couldn't have done it without them. So you can see on both this slide, or the previous slide and this slide, right, who's part of that group. And that's a key piece, again, of our strategy, because we also know this group takes back some of the feedback from the meetings and some of the almost assignments we've given them to take back to their colleagues to get additional feedback, which is really what we want all of you to do with the draft standards and the opportunity for this first round of feedback. So just very quickly too about the structure, we wanted to make this iterative and visible. And so we have the council, as you just heard about, and you'll get to meet further with the panelists. We also are bringing together 4 working groups that actually expand then the membership of the council. And you'll hear in just a moment about the research team, which has already been formed and hard at work. And you'll also hear from Elizabeth about the research agenda and how these leading researchers have helped shape the evidence base that has gone into the draft revised standards. We're excited that we are going to be inviting and convening additional people to come and experts on 3 different teams: the writing and content development team, the district, state, and province team, and then finally the kind of standards review team that have different purposes, right? So you'll hear later about the suite of implementation tools that we will be developing and finalizing in 2021. And that will be one of the key areas for the writing and content team. We'll also be asking the district, state, and province team to take a hard look at the revised standards to make sure the intersection of policy and practice are aligned and to make sure that implementation is clear for policymakers and for those kind of at the province, state, and district level, so they can also see themselves in the standards and also know what's clear about how to take deeper ownership. And then finally, we will convene a review team that will help do a final review towards the end of this process. And we'll share the timeline at the end of this session about what that's going to look like for the revised standards process as well. So we know this is quick, but hope this was a kind of a quick overview, at least of the structure. And now Elizabeth's going to talk a little bit about our research agenda and what we're hoping to accomplish and have accomplished so far with the research team. So Elizabeth, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here today and for being interested in how we are developing and updating the research foundation for the draft revised standards. As you'll see on the slide in front of you, we have a strong research team that has been helping us by providing us with recommendations, studies, papers, references, and a lot of thought-provoking questions and discussions for us. This is a way that we are sort of demonstrating our commitment to a broad look at the research related to professional learning. You'll see that we have international experts, experts in the learning sciences, individuals who have contributed to evaluations of standards implementations over the years, as well as a couple of people on the group who are particularly focused on bridging the researcher practitioner relationship. We'll not call it a divide, but we'll call it improving the relationship between researchers and practitioners and thinking a lot about relevance and application. And we're thrilled to have Carol Campbell, the co-chair of this working team, with us as a panelist today. I will say that what we are committed to is looking at how the research and evidence from the field has evolved since the last release of the standards in 2011. So what that's meant is, in addition to conversations with this wonderful research team, we as an internal standards team have been reviewing various studies, implementation studies, meta-analyses, survey data, various frameworks. As we have been digging into the revision of each standard, we've been careful to look at the existing standard as well as relevant updates to research and evidence from the field since 2011. So one of the undertakings we've been really excited about is a partnership with the American Institutes for Research. They have already conducted a literature review using this current standards as a framework for coding and conversations. And they looked at 38 studies that fit very tight parameters. We wanted to build this foundation of the research for the revision over time and using some different strategies and methods to be really clear on what kinds of research can tell us what kinds of things about professional learning. So this was one of the first initiatives of the revision team. AIR looked at these 38 studies, and they looked specifically at randomized control trial studies that included outcomes that were observable in teacher practice and student outcomes. So the studies had to be had to have both in order to be included in this literature review. And the review found that there was evidence of all the concepts in the 2011 standards. And we had some very illuminating conversations about how there are concepts in the current standards that overlap from standard to standard, and how important that is in terms of how we revise the standards and add our new standards related to equity. One of the really interesting and important conversations we had as a result of this literature review was around the fact that the randomized control trial studies, because they're so tightly scoped, often don't reveal very much in the way of findings about context and about equity. And so that is an area that we know we need to look to the field and to expertise in the field to really build that research base for the new standards. There was also some findings in this literature review about how much the field has progressed in terms of research about content expertise, instructional materials, curriculum-based professional learning, and how much more we know about coaching from the research than in 2011. So we are really excited about this as a foundational piece in the research informing the revision. We're using it mostly as an internal document, but we'll share excerpts of it in a paper that will come out in early 2021, right, yeah. And then we're also excited about our next endeavor with AIR, which is that they are conducting a meta-analysis to look more deeply at the concepts that they found in the literature review. So they're taking the initial 38 studies and including some additional studies that showed change in teacher practice, but don't always have the student outcome measure. And that's a way of expanding what we're able to look at and implications we're able to draw from the research. And where this meta-analysis is still in the coding stage, but we're excited to see some early findings in the spring about what this tells us about how the elements of professional learning can be parsed out and identified in terms of the result they have on teaching practice and student outcomes. And then we have a dream of conducting an additional meta-analysis where we can look at some of the teacher outcomes that are non-observable, such as beliefs and mindsets. And that's something that we see as a real need, and the literature review and this first meta-analysis are documenting for us that that is a real need. And this is exciting because it informs a research agenda for learning forward and for the field that lives beyond the release of the standards. So we're really excited and appreciative of the partnership with AIR and the work of our research, our standards research team to guide and inform this work. And I'll just close by saying that we are interested and curious about what studies you all in the session today would point us to. We're looking for that kind of feedback when you look at the standards. What studies or concepts or areas of research would you point us to explore a little further as we do the next version of the revision of the standards. So that was very quick, but I hope it gives you a sense for the work we're doing and how excited we are about all these different partnerships.
All right, and we know we'll meet the folks, at least some of the folks behind this work as you have your panel conversation. So thanks, Elizabeth. So before we get to that, I just want to talk a little bit about the rationale for revised standards. So, you know, it isn't that we just hit the 10-year mark and say, it's time to revise, because it's such an interesting, meaty project, though it certainly is. So as we, you know, when we sit here in 2020 and we look back on 10 years ago as the 2011 revision was underway, and we really understand so much more now about what constitutes a high quality professional learning system, what do effective learning teams look like and how do they operate. We know so much more about college and career ready standards, about high quality instructional materials, and our aspirations to equity have much greater clarity. And certainly 2020 brings a lot of that to the fore. So it's really an amazing time to be undertaking this work and thinking about what is it that educators need. The unanticipated has certainly happened this year. And so how can standards support that even as they remain enduring over time? And we also, we know much more from our stakeholders and the wisdom of the field about what's important to support implementation, policy shifts, and deep understanding that leads toward really changes in practice in the classroom. So there's just a few of the elements on the screen about, you know, equity and excellence is a key driver. The research and evidence is what we'll talk about today in our focus conversation. And just really looking at the inequities that go up and down across every aspect of the system and how do we address those. And I hope you'll see that challenge reflected in the first draft that we put out there. When we talk about implementation, I'll just mention that the implementation tools that have always accompanied standards for professional learning, we will have a body of implementation tools. If you're familiar with the innovation configuration maps, you'll see those in role-based implementation guides, as well as the SAI. We will update the standards assessment inventory and add some progress monitoring tools to help folks keep track of their work as they move along and to assist in monitoring to move toward the highest quality possible. So, you know, we're having this lab now in late 2020. There's a draft out there. We're going to get as much feedback as we can pull from people, and that will inform the work that we do over the course of 2021, and just being really clear about what makes your work possible and how do we support your aspirations. So with that, we will turn to the panel, and it's been great to see everybody's faces, and hope that you bring your cameras back on. But for now, we're going to highlight the faces of our panelists. So if you turn your camera off, obviously we're all muted. They're going to talk for about an hour. If you are adept with your video settings, you can always hide non-video participants, and then the faces of the speakers are larger in the frame, and that's great. And please stay active in the chat box. Send your questions to the panel, and we really want this to be a rich conversation, not only among them, but among us all. And really, what are your what input and hopes do you have around the evidence that really undergirds how we approach the revision? So with that, Elizabeth, I'll leave it to you and your team.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Well, as Tracy said, and a couple of people have said already, we are thrilled to have this panel with us today. It is not often that you get a chance to spend an hour with experts in the field like this who are really focused on what it means to build standards based on research and evidence. And so I'm really appreciative of this panel today. And I will say that Maria Heiler was planning to join us, but had a last-minute conflict. She did, however, leave us with some provocative questions during our preparation call that I'm sure we'll address today as well. So what I'd like to do is first ask each of our panelists to just introduce themselves, give us your just a little snippet of your background and what brings you to this Learning Forward Standards conversation. And we'll start with Carol.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for that generous welcome to all of us on the panel. I'm delighted to join in this conversation today, and thank you to Learning Forward to participate in your conference, although we're virtual this year, but it's great to be here. So my name is Carol Campbell. I'm an Associate Professor of Leadership and Educational Change at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, at the University of Toronto. So greetings from a sunny Toronto in Canada this afternoon. It's also cold, so cold and snowy here in Toronto. I've been engaged in education my entire career in a range of roles in the education sector, in government as a senior official and as an advisor to senior politicians, and now, of course, as a member of faculty as an academic. I've lived and worked in the UK, USA and Canada, as well as working on international projects, as well as my university role. Two other roles at the moment are I'm a member of the International Council of Education Advisors, which provides advice to the government in Scotland. And I'm a board member of the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement, ICSE, that brings together researchers, policymakers and practitioners. And my work is concerned with large-scale educational change at the level of countries, states, districts and schools, with a focus on equity and excellence for all students. I have a particular interest in the role, the work and the development of the education profession, hence my involvement here, so leadership and professional learning. And I also look at work around research use towards evidence-informed policy and practice. And then this year, since March, of course, COVID has been a major part of my work in looking at the implications for schooling and students across the world, as well as here locally. So thank you for the opportunity to join the panel today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. That is, I'm getting the sense that you neither sleep nor eat, given that list. Thanks. Okay, next, could we hear from you, Brian?
Sure. Hi, I'm Brian Goodwin. I'm the president and CEO of McCrell International. We are a nonprofit. I'm based here in Denver, in my basement in Denver, Colorado. We also have an office in Hawaii where we serve the Pacific region. We are one of those boundary spanner organizations, Elizabeth, that we have 1 foot very much steeped in research. In fact, you saw our VP, Kelly Kim, is on the panel with the research panel with Carol. But we also do a lot of professional learning. So we have been around like Learning Forward for 50 years, always with the charge to translate good research into practical application tools, and then get that in the hands of teachers. But more than just get it in the hands of teachers, is make sure that teachers can implement that research effectively. And so we see transformation, so we see better student outcomes. Myself personally, I've been at McCrell actually 22 years. Before that, though, I was a teacher. I was also a journalist, and now I write a lot of books from McCrell, doing the same idea of translating research into practice, trying to get at the so what. You know, it's nice to have a research report, but what does it mean for educators? What can we do about it? So, you know, I come to the Learning Forward work very interested in this idea of what does effective professional learning look like, because that's what matters, right? It's how do we get the work to make a difference for the people that we know need it most, which are our kids. And McCrell, by the way, we were chartered during the war on poverty. So we are always very focused on equity, better outcomes for all learners. And obviously we see teacher transformation, changing practice in the classroom is really where we feel like the action happens. I'm sure you all agree too. So thank you.
And,
I'm Cheryl Craven.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Yes, I'm Cheryl Cravens. I'm a professor of education policy at Peabody College of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt University. So my work has really been very related to what Carol and Brian were talking about. It's really about translation. It's about translating things that we know that are effective based on research, but eventually connect that with practice. The work that we've been working on, some of that is related to principal leadership. You know, how do you assess and evaluate principals' effectiveness, but making sure that it's what principals do instead of, you know, what the principals actually, their qualities or personalities. But the most recent work that I'm most proud of is related to teacher leadership and how teacher leadership, that's actually part of professional learning and also their instructional quality and improvement. One of the examples was learning from the models that we know, collaborative inquiry models, lesson planning, that are common in Asian education systems, but see if that actually is a actionable and doable task to implement in a different setting, in a different culture, in different maybe norms, say in public schools in the South, in a state like Tennessee. And so it's been such a wonderful experience working with Learning Forward and to see some of that work in place. And I will say that it's wonderful to see this, that for Learning Forward and this learning lab, like Tracy talked about, as they really preach what they, practice what they preach. It's an iterative, continuously improved model that they're working on. And I look forward to discussing that with today's audience.
All right, well, it's wonderful to meet you all. And Elizabeth is experiencing the vagaries of technology. So I think, Carol, you were going to start out with your answer to the question, I do believe, about why is just this emphasis on evidence so important for professional learning and to standards in general?
Thanks, Tracy. So I'm going to talk about a few experiences connected to my work with Learning Forward and my work more generally about, obviously, I'm an academic, so I think research is important, but how that is involved in professional learning, both in the content of professional learning, but also the processes and the work of people involved. So I first collaborated with Learning Forward in 2016. When I was asked to lead a study of the state of educators' professional learning in Canada. We had a very large research team and we had advisors and support and input from across Canada. So if anyone's part of this conversation that was part of that study, thank you very much. You will be familiar with the fact that Linda Darling-Hammond and colleagues had looked at the state of the learning profession for Learning Forward, looking at international evidence and the USA that was also part of a previous iteration of standards development. So I was asked to conduct a similar study, but in Canada, to look at what we were learning. And we worked across all 10 provinces and 3 territories in Canada to look at the state of educators' professional learning here. And we released that report at the 2016 Learning Forward conference, and the full report and case studies and supporting resources are on the Learning Forward website. So what we found was that our findings broadly are aligned with Learning Forward's 2011 professional standards. We saw evidence of all of those standards in practice in Canada and their importance, but they didn't fully match. We also saw differences. We saw differences in detail, differences in nuance, some differences in interpretation or prioritization, difference in practice and approach within Canada, and then in different parts of Canada, which I actually would expect would be the same everywhere. So different provinces and territories, like states, have different contexts, urban and rural, Indigenous communities. So while we could see the link to the standards, we were also saying there are some things here where we think there are some differences in what we found. And some of what I'll highlight was that at the time of that study, 2016, the area that educators here in Canada identified as their main priority was to support diverse learners in inclusive classrooms, the piece about equity. Now, of course, subject knowledge, curriculum, pedagogy, technology, all of these matter too, but the piece around increasing diversity and equity. There was another equity dimension about the educators themselves. We saw large inequitable variations in access to high quality professional learning. So we had the two pieces, one about student equity, but also about educator equity. And then I guess on the sort of research use piece that we've already started talking about, a broader range of evidence. So the standards had emphasised the use of data, which of course is very important, but there was a concern to have a broader range of inquiry and evidence and professional judgment, processes of collaboration, and to think about outcomes broadly for students, absolutely student achievement, but other types of outcomes, and to also think about outcomes for the adult learners, the professionals as well, and to really value educators' voice and choice at the heart of professional learning. So now 2020, when I was asked to become part of the Standards for Professional Learning Advisory Council, I was honoured to be part of this group and to now co-chair the research team with Maria Heiler. And I want to thank all members of the research team who have been doing absolutely phenomenal work and advice. Elizabeth spoke about some of the work that's happened already, the AIR literature review that has looked at what have we learned over the past 10 years about improvements and changes in professional learning linked to measurable outcomes for students. So there's very solid work there. AIR similarly found evidence and support for the 2011 standards, but suggested that maybe they needed some revision in light of latest evidence. Elizabeth already mentioned that obviously the approach to the systematic review prioritised measurable effect sizes, which generally were randomised control trials. So now we also want to look more broadly at the range of evidence concerning educators and students, and the range of research methods. My own work is mixed methodologies, so case studies, prioritising teachers' voices and experiences, evidence from professional judgment and practice, so a range of evidence as we move forward. And that's why in the new standards, I like the use of vignettes to sort of bring the ideas to life with concrete practical examples. So based on what I've said, obviously I was pleased to see the revised standards that we're going to discuss today. I was pleased to see that some of what we had suggested was included, also a range of research and a range of advice, and now of course open to this much larger review. Tracy said it, you know, by the start of 2020, we had a substantial body of evidence about professional learning and about developing the education profession, about student learning, and a range of other factors. But we've also experienced dramatic change this year, and some of those issues about equity have become much more pronounced, about integration of technology, about the various forms of learning that can take place as we move forward. So this is very timely. I particularly appreciate the focus on equity in the new standards. So that piece about diversity and inclusion, I personally think it is there much more strongly now for students. the idea of reaching every student, but also equity for educators and the education profession in terms of recruitment and development and leadership and career trajectories matters. And the standard that we're going to dig deep into today, collaborative inquiry, does bring in those processes around a broader range of evidence and professional inquiry and judgment. So I welcome these standards. I have lived and worked in the US, but I'm looking at them from a context outside of the US, because one of Learning Forward's aspirations is that these may have resonance and appeal globally, and certainly we have Learning Forward affiliates here in Canada who are paying close attention. So I would welcome any advice or suggestions about the international dimension, as well as, of course, the US dimension. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you all for letting me drop off for a minute and fix my internet and come back on there. It's always exciting to do that, right? But I really appreciate, Carol, the way you've referenced aspects of the revision that reflect the research, and we appreciate your input and the input of the team and the advisory council in that regard, because that has really helped add to the revision. So now let's hear from Brian. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll probably echo some of the same things that Carol said. They just won't sound as lovely when I say them. But, you know, I thought about this idea of evidence kind of in two different dimensions. And one is, actually, I go back to, this is probably, I don't know, several years ago. I remember talking to some of our professional developers, and we were seeing disparate outcomes with the work that we're doing, right? We had some schools where it felt like they could take the evidence-based practices and really run with them when they were seeing positive outcomes for kids. And then candidly, frankly, there were places where we weren't seeing the same kind of outcomes. So I remember asking our professional developers, well, what's different? And they said, well, you have to look deeper at what's happening with teachers. And I said, okay, do tell, go on. And they said, what the biggest difference is there's a like an aha moment for teachers when they become intentional with their practice, when they understand why they're doing what they're doing. They're not just taking something they've been told to do, but they really get it. And that kind of struck a chord for me, because I remember as a teacher, you know, probably early on, doing evidence-based practices, but not knowing why I was doing them. It's, oh, we're going to do cooperative learning because it's Wednesday or whatever, right? Not understanding the science of learning. There's an arc of learning, and there's a time to use cooperative learning. And I think what we're really trying to do is help teachers become good consumers of research. And what we're talking about, Tony McKay was talking in the last session about professionalizing the profession. That's what we want, is teachers to be professionals. And what professionals do is they diagnose and solve problems. I was thinking about this just this week. I took my daughter into the doctor with an ear. She had an earache. She still has an earache going on for a couple of weeks. The doctor was able to say, well, I tried this last time when you were here. I'm going to try something different. That's because she's bringing a knowledge base about her craft and saying, well, I'm diagnosing and solving that problem. And that's where we want to get teachers to. And that's where PD is not training. And I love the way the standards make it really clear. PD is not done to teachers. It's done with them, right? It's done for them. And so I think the second key element that comes out of the second reason that evidence is so important is to make sure that what we're designing for professional learning experiences also reflects the research. And I was recently digging into the research on online professional learning, which feels obviously very germane right now. I write a column for Educational Leadership magazine. It's the Research Matters. It's a very short column. I wish it were longer. That would be easier, but I do a column every month. And so I was looking into the research on online PD. And what I was finding is that actually it can work. This was also selfish because as we were doing more work at McCrell that's online, I wanted to make sure we're not taking what doesn't work in face-to-face and putting it online. So, but what you find is like, it needs to be job embedded. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to have coaching supports. There needs to be communities of practice. So there can be an element that's digital, that's virtual, but you still have to have this social element. And you look at those things, you go, well, and there has to be coaching, right? Peer-to-peer coaching. It's like, that's just good professional learning, right? So I think that, and for me, that gets back to the equity question, right? What we know that the distribution of teacher quality is actually evident in most schools. You've got some great teachers. You've got some teachers that are still struggling. high performing schools, they figure out how to make it so that every teacher is a great teacher and every kid deserves to have a great teacher. So I think we need to combine both these elements, help our teachers become professionals by providing the conditions that help each and every one of them be successful in the classroom. So to me, that's why I'm so excited about the new standards and the emphasis on evidence throughout in both of those dimensions. So thank you. We can talk more later.
Thank you. Yes, I'm one of the things I'm really excited about with this panel is you're seeding some questions that I hope all of you will address and discuss later on. I think, this question of access, inequities of access to high quality professional learning among educators is critical, as is the access of practitioners to relevant research that really informs their practice. And I hope we can get into that a little bit later. So thank you, Brian. And now let's turn to Sho.
Thank you. Again, it's just such a pleasure and also an honor to be on this panel and to hear some great summaries coming from Carol and Brian. I think about the advances we have made in the field, especially as researchers looking at professional learning and professional development. I feel like maybe there are three things that we have been able to accomplish maybe in the last few decades up to 2020, and think about all the work that folks have been doing. One is to be able to describe what good practices look like, maybe more. In terms of what does good teaching looks like, what does good principal leadership looks like when it's actually impacting the schools and the teachers, and think about the assessments, the frameworks, and think about the rubrics that we have been able to develop. In lots of the states and districts now use evaluation tools, instruments, and rubrics to be able to actually look at a map of good practices and to be able to also to go in and provide formative assessments and sometimes a summative assessment. So that's one advance we've made in the field in terms of research on professional learning. The other advance, I think, is not only to look at what good practices look like, because we know that it needs to be job embedded in every setting is different. A math teacher's good practice might actually look slightly different from the English teacher. A principal in a low-income neighborhood might actually be very different from a high-achieving school. But it's this part of looking at the mechanism, the processes. So not what you need to do, but also how you would do it. I think it's an important advance that lots of the empirical research have been able to do to identify, is it collaborative inquiry? Is it the learning cycles? Is it improvement science type of iterative processes? So on the mechanism and on the process, I think that's the second advance the research field has been able to work on. And then the last part I feel like is on just the methodology. We talked about the literature review being done by IRR, and it's looking at, what are the criteria you have to look at either the what or the hows. And in addition to using RCTs, and I love the fact that the review has identified the limitations of the RCTs, and to be able to, only looking at causal inferences and to look at comparison groups. I teach research design, and these are some of the criteria we put, to make sure that these things are acceptable, but there are limitations. So the methodology, the advances, I think it's helpful, especially for practitioners to learn how to be savvy consumers of this work. We then could critique the validity of the studies, and how good are these studies, but also the external validities, how useful are these studies for. And so those are the three things I feel like this set of revised standards, which I'm really pleased to see, incorporating the things, these advances in the research field into the new set of standards. So then the standards become this bridge. I cannot tell you how many times I'm frustrated sitting in academic conferences and looking at these really good studies and thinking, but how does this, how can be useful on Monday morning, 7:30 for educators. You know, what does that mean? So the standards, if they are good, they are the tools, the bridge, you know, for practitioners to translate, to operationalize these, you know, good advances we've made in the research. And I see that because there are three categories the standards have identified. One is the conditions that need to be there or need to be developed. The other one is the process. So I talked about the mechanisms, the processes. So now the standards identify the, you know, the set of processes that need to be there or can be developed. And then the third part is the content, is the rigor of the content and types of content that need to be in place. So that's a really good way to incorporate the things we've learned from research. One is the processes is how, you know, the content is about what, but the conditions is where this, you can marry the how and the what with what you need to identify. So the way we actually make a difference is what works under what conditions and for whom. That I think the standards are doing this excellent job of taking us from research and stand on this bridge, looking at what we have to do. So what does that mean to practice? If you have standards like this, I see some of the potentials of once you actually looking at the conditions and process and content for, if we think about the inequities in access to quality professional learning, especially for educators and in many ways principals, then we could then use these tools to do a few things. One is to design, you know, design either in service or these professional development opportunities may be external. I'm not going to call that training, Brian, because you said that's not training. But, you know, so there's always the in-service part, and there's also the additional expertise you will need, because eventually you run out of in-house expertise. Even when you do collaborative inquiry, you still need additional expertise to design, to actually measure, to evaluate continuously what you are doing. Does it actually make a difference? It's that validation piece. If we want to be true professionals, there are a few things that we need to realign ourselves as practitioners. One is to be able to actually, you know, see what good practices are, but also be able to actually build towards that direction and measure and validate those improvements that you're making. So I definitely see great potential. I think collaborative inquiry, I think we're going to talk a little bit more further about this, it's a good mechanism to be able to do a few of the things on content that we want to actually accomplish. So I look forward to getting some questions from the audience and to see if we can have a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Jo. That you covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, and there are certainly some areas that we'll follow up on as a whole panel here. But first, I want to just ask if Brian or Carol, if you wanted to respond, or if any of you wanted to respond to each other's opening remarks there.
Sure. You know, Sho was making me think too about, we were discussing before the session started, that I know for some folks, 10 standards may seem like a lot, right? But that's what the research says. And I think when you look at the research, sometimes you see studies that'll say, well, coaching doesn't work. Well, it depends what they were coaching on, right? And Sho made the comment about you need outside experts, because sometimes you become your own echo chamber. So yes, it's great to have peer coaching and to have things that's inquiry based, but sometimes you need to bring in that outside expertise. The studies would also suggest that. And so I think the point too is that the standards are additive. And you can't just do piecemeal. I'll just do this one. I can't tell you how often we're doing some professional learning and we look around the room and go, where's the principal? Where's the superintendent? Leadership is important, right? So I think while it may feel like there's a lot there, I think the point is that the more that this becomes sort of an intervention bundle, that you're putting these pieces together, the more powerful the professional learning will be too. So some of the show's comments made me think about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because as we were writing the revised culture of collaborative inquiry standard, we thought a lot and read a lot of research about sort of how much those mechanisms and processes were both a driver and a result, really an outcome of continued cycles is what makes those cycles more and more meaningful and useful over time. So I think that Sho's point about those as critical to that standard and really to the implementation of the whole set of standards is an important one. And I wanted to ask a question that I think you all touched on, and it's this question about randomized controlled trials and how we value and almost prioritize research that has in the past been called gold standard research. And we know that there are structural inequities in the kinds of research that gets funded or selected or supported in academic settings in certain areas. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit what it means to expand our definition of research and evidence and why that's important in the standards for professional learning.
I could jump in first, and Carol and Brian, maybe you can help me too. I see RCTs, the golden standards, especially when you have the classic experimental design, are studies with good internal validity, meaning they're good studies to claim the causal impact, but not necessarily with good or external validity that are maybe applicable or wide-ranging for practitioners. And then this is a sweeping statement, so don't go back to research design classes and say I said that. It's because, these are good definitely golden standards, because you can then claim the difference. If you have a control group, you have an experimental group, and then you can say that it's because of this stimulus, whatever the professional development that we have provided, we can say there's this much difference. But because of that, either you have a limited, or more controlled setting, and then also people tend to actually, you work with volunteers, and then you sort them into two groups. So there are all kinds of limitations to external validity. I actually see the same method, however, could actually be applied to action research. When we actually see people, folks in Singapore, in Shanghai, in lots of other places, lesson study or collaborative inquiry practices, in many ways, are just these mini experiments, mini trials. You see teachers actually say, we have 3 ways of teaching this math lesson, and let's all try in similar types of classroom settings, and then see how that actually works out. You compare notes, and then you identify the changes or things that worked and didn't work, and you move forward. Same concept, same methods, but it's actually more, doable, actionable, and can be applied. So I don't think this is about method. It's actually about connecting that with the settings and the conditions or resources teachers actually have.
Thank you. Brian or Carol?
I'll come in here. I fully support what Jo's said. RCTs are well-designed studies, so we're not coming from a place of criticizing RCTs, and in fact for the AIR systematic review, they were a good starting place, because one of the challenges with professional learning, and I've seen this written in the new standards document, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this, is that without some sort of measurable impact, professional learning is often seen as something that gets cut for funding, or programs get cut for funding. So, a part of my own work has been evaluation of professional learning programs, hopefully to demonstrate their effectiveness, but they're in times of scarce resources, which we are in now, there will be challenges around funding for professional learning. So we do need measurable outcomes in different ways. And RCTs provide evidence linked to, significant positive effects. There are some challenges though, so they should not be the only method, and I think that's what Jo has said as well. One challenge is, in order to do a meta-analysis, you're looking at previous studies, so they won't capture everything that's changed this year, and yet important things have changed, and we have rapid evidence emerging from practice and from some research studies now. Not all professional learning will necessarily provide measurable student achievement outcomes, and that's a debate. Some people think it should, but the reality is it won't. There will be some professional learning that improves teacher efficacy and knowledge and skills, and may or may not result in increased test scores. When the AIR study completed, there was very little on equity by the nature of the design, because obviously learning about culturally responsive pedagogy or anti-racism or Indigenous ways of knowing are about changing educators' understanding, knowledge, language, use of resources. Again, will not always immediately or directly impact student outcomes. So RCTs are a good starting point, but we're keen to also bring in action research, educators' voices, educators' experiences, evaluation models, particularly at this moment in time when, it's important that the standards hopefully will last for another decade. Who knows, things are moving fast nowadays. But the pieces around equity and integration of technology and rapid change, we can't say because they're not in an RCT, they don't matter. We have to think about what matters and then what evidence there is or isn't to support that.
And so I would just build on both of those comments. I think that maybe the important thing is for educators to start to think like researchers, to have first of all, like, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the outcome we're hoping to see? Sometimes we'll ask people that question, like, how will you know if we're successful? And there's like a long pause, like they haven't thought that through. So I think first starting with what's the outcome you want, and then, okay, and this is going to be our intervention, right? So you're thinking about, there's the dependent variable, there's now the independent variable. But then really making sure that you've implemented well, because I think that's where things a lot of times get lost in translations, because just because it says in an RCT that this worked is no guarantee it's going to work in your system. And so I think there should be a lot of skepticism anyway, kind of in Missouri, they call it the show me state, right? Show me this is going to work. I think education systems ought to say, let's be collecting data. And what Show was sharing, you can be doing your own action research. Maybe you want to start in just one school and pilot something to make sure. I don't think a lot of districts do this, but before you go full scale, let's make sure it worked and then figure out what conditions were present when it worked. Or maybe you do 2 schools and figure out, how do we make sure we replicate this across the entire system? So I mentioned earlier the idea of teachers becoming metacognitive. I think education systems should also become metacognitive about why are we doing what we're doing, how will we know when it's worked, and how will we make the right tweaks if it's not coming out, like we thought it would.
Thank you. I'm going to answer a question that's somewhat related that's in the chat box about, 2 questions specifically about the standards revision that looks like Lisa Johnson and Kim Reynolds have both had a chance to look at. The question is, discuss the decision to remove PLCs as a standard. And I'll answer this, but if any of you have comments on it, I think that would be great. The title of learning communities and professional learning communities, which is the title of the standard in the 2011, the current standards, we have realized that the research and the research related to that term, and that term itself and that model itself has really taken on somewhat of a different tone than it had in 2011. And we know that there's research that says that some educators are adverse to PLCs as a mechanism, and that it doesn't always represent the ideal to educators, to practitioners, that it does in some places. And so we made a decision to broaden the title of that standard, but then also it gave us the opportunity to provide more context around the PLC approach that includes the culture of collaboration and a focus on how you sustain inquiry and continuous learning over time with the PLC as a vehicle or a mechanism for doing that. So that is, that's sort of a little bit of a peek behind the scenes of our process. But if any of you have thoughts on that, it would be great to hear them.
I could probably just share from our experience implementing collaborative inquiry models in public schools in Tennessee. That PLC for sure is a concept that is widely accepted. And I think it's still very good. And we use a lot of that literature from professional learning, a professional community, and PLC. So yes, there are a few different ways people are calling it. People also, use critical friends, and they have other. So a lot of these have maybe the same connotations of people working together and collaborate, and share. I think maybe what's missing is this action component. It's the process, is how you actually do this. And also there's what's also missing, maybe the validation component. And I want to just go back, think about, Brian talked about our teachers being professionals, and this, what are some of the things that make us maybe not as professional compared to, the doctors and lawyers and the engineers, and a few things. One is to have what we do public, visible. The other is for the work to be, shareable, and the third part is the validation. And so PLC is an excellent concept, but there are a few elements that are probably missing. Is that validation piece, is that, making it also this kind of a continuous improvement piece, not quite there. But I think it's an important condition that needs to be there if you were to go in there to implement some of these processes and to make the content also rigorous. So I don't feel like it's a rebellion against it. Is actually to be on using that as fertile ground and to build some of the more action-oriented steps.
Yeah, the document, nor are we saying that don't do a PLC. It's just, I think we all know there are PLCs that work and PLCs that don't. And I think we're trying to get at the culture of collaborative inquiry is oftentimes the magic of what makes them work. And it's also the reflection. We talk about using data as a mirror, not as a window. Sometimes you see a PLC come together and they're looking at data and thinking about what it means for somebody else. Oh, the specialist needs to come in and help the kids or something, as opposed to what does this mean about our professional practice and how we might improve instruction. So I think we were trying to highlight some things in the document, or that Learning Forward is like, these are the critical elements when you have a PLC. So no one's saying get rid of your PLCs. Just be clear. Right.
No one's saying get rid of your PLCs. And in fact, we're saying if you have PLCs, that's a wonderful mechanism to take advantage of, to implement and realize your commitment to ongoing learning and inquiry. So Carol, did you want to add there? Or you don't?
Yeah, I agree with the points that have been made. I mean, there's now decades of work around professional collaboration that has evolved, and there's been different terms and different terminology and different acronyms over the years. So obviously PLCs are significant, have been significant. Collaborative inquiries now being widely used. We have collaborative professionalism. So part of me would say worry less about the label, but as Jo and Brian were saying, think about the, the purpose, the processes, the content, and the action. Collaboration, when it's effective, is extremely powerful. Now, there are times when individual professional learning is important too, depending on what it is that you're doing, but collaborative opportunities, there has been some places that are doing PLCs, and there will be other places that have rich PLCs. Similarly, collaborative inquiry that's inquiry but without strong content and expertise is not effective either. So certainly not a rebellion against PLCs, it's just thinking about what makes really effective collaboration, and then how can that be taken forward.
Thank you. So this is a great great conversation, and this conversation about PLCs and culture of collaborative inquiry is one that we've had internally for a long time. So I'm glad it was raised in this conversation, and I appreciate your thoughtful responses there. The other interesting sort of ongoing conversation we're having is about outcomes, teacher and student outcomes. And I'm wondering if you would share your thinking about, you mentioned, Carol, there are sort of student outcomes that are in immediate demand by certain segments of the education world. And then there are other outcomes related to things like teacher efficacy or building knowledge that are somewhat, that seem to take a back seat sometimes to the student outcome conversation. I'm wondering if you could just talk about the expanded thinking around outcomes for professional learning and how you see that impacting this revision of the standards. And anyone can jump in first.
I think this is a challenging one. I mean, student achievement matters. Literacy and numeracy matter, science matters. I mean, all of these things matter. And of course, that's the most important thing, high quality school leadership and high quality teaching to support student learning and student outcomes. Certainly in our work here in Canada, there was a concern about, not intentionally, but too narrow a focus on standardized testing. I mean, there are debates about standardized testing, and those debates vary in different places. But the concern about student leadership, student voice, engagement, participation, a broader understanding. Certainly what we're seeing in the context of the pandemic is the importance of independent learning skills, problem solving, communication, self-regulation. Now, I'm not saying all of those now need to be measured in some tested way, but we want to support our students in their holistic development. And we know that the chain to get there involves teacher confidence, knowledge, skills, practices, student confidence, knowledge, skills, and practices. So the concern was, if we exclusively focused on standardized testing, it would miss out on the broader development of the education profession and students. But that's not to say that achievement doesn't matter. Of course, it absolutely matters.
I would just, also just follow up with that too, it is that causal chain that it takes a few more steps between providing professional learning opportunities, good one, type of opportunities for teachers, and then eventually shows up for that to show up in the students' learning, and there are a few steps in between. Now, I will say it will be necessary, and Carol talked about this before, to substantiate the impact and to provide evidence that this is actually leading to the desired outcomes, even just for especially in the political environment when you need to validate your improvement. And so maybe a few things you could do is to identify ways to quantify or to measure, even to, using qualitative measures to identify these kind of improvements. Not only just in teachers' sense of, efficacy or trust, but also I think a good intermediary step would be the instructional practice. And so, if we're looking for a signpost of when professional learning is actually producing outcome, it probably would be most visible in how teachers actually teach. And in that, maybe that's one step in between professional learning and student learning is the teachers, how they work together. Do they actually we talked about PLC or collaborative inquiry, but it still needs to show up in what they do. And that could be one is when they actually do get together, what do they talk about? There's definitely research about the depth and the coherence and, also how much that's aligned with the quality of standards of curriculum, for example. So that can be analyzed and measured. And the other one is actually about whether or not they have the type of practices, do they actually observe one another? Do they actually provide valuable feedback? Those are things actually are quite measurable that we know that research have demonstrated that's directly linked with improved practice in teaching and also to students learning.
I like what Carol and Joe were both saying there about the causal chain. I mentioned earlier, educators thinking more like researchers. So, a researcher tool that we all like is the logic model. Researchers like it, but it can be really powerful because it can lay out is there actually a causal chain here? By having this professional learning and these coaching experiences, what is the change in teacher practice we're expecting to see? And what might that affect in terms of student outcomes? And student outcomes, yes, should be defined very broadly. Most RCTs are done usually on standardized achievement tests. That's the simplest measure. So again, it goes back to, as an education system, saying what are the steps that will get us there? Recognizing that it's going to take time. I remember I was talking to a school in Melbourne. They were doing amazing, inquiry projects, all that stuff. I asked the principal, where did you start? And she said, well, I started with not having fights in the schoolyard, right? So you always have to start somewhere, but sometimes you start thinking about, okay, if we can create a better, more cohesive environment, then we can start to do these different teaching practices, then we'll do this. And so I think it's laying out that causal chain, which then becomes your theory of action that you're testing and measuring as you go along.
It's so interesting because as you were all speaking, I was just thinking about how important it is that people understand this causal pathway, because it supports the argument that an investment of time and sustained attention is really what is going to result in outcomes for students in any professional learning initiative, that it really takes time in order to work through that causal chain. And that's something that I think is not always apparent when we're doing advocacy work or talking about why a particular approach should be funded or should be a priority for a school or district. So I appreciate you drawing that out.
It can also really be helpful to keep your momentum going, because a lot of times the things that we're looking at are the lagging indicators, right? Student outcomes come last. And so if you can be saying, these are the leading indicators, these are the change in teacher practice and efficacy, student engagement, these things we think are going to lead to this, then you can also be sharing with board members and parents and others that might be wondering, how come you don't have outcomes already? If you can show, well, we're moving towards this ultimate outcome, but it's going to take us some time to get there.
Right. Excellent. And that leads me actually to another question. I just read a study last week or 2 weeks ago about how science teachers are eager for new research that helps them understand the standards, the NGSS standards, but that it is challenging for them to understand to know how to access current research and then how to assess quality of research. And this goes a little bit to what we've heard, what we've been talking about throughout this hour about sort of different types of research and how and what is relevant and for whom. And so I'm wondering if you could all talk about some experiences you've had or models you know of that really help support teachers and probably school leaders and district leaders in understanding how to access and assess quality of research that's relevant to their work.
I'll nominate Brian to talk about this first.
I second that nomination.
You know, a place that I often look myself is I do look at the What Works Clearinghouse. There are practice guides. That's a starting point to know, is this rigorous research? There are hundreds of studies in there. I've looked at several. And you can find out, is this rigorous research or not? Now, that doesn't mean that you throw out everything else, but it's a starting point. I think I would be remiss if I didn't point people towards the What Works Clearinghouse. There are both studies in there, and there are also practice guides that are really great. And so I think I would maybe start there, and then I mean, it's a methodology to know whether this is a rigorous study or not. Certainly, I think there are other clues. I think, is it in a peer-reviewed publication? Do you see other citations of it? That's usually a good starting point as well. And then I guess I'd come back to, and ultimately, if it looks like it makes sense, then think about how do we study it in our own system to make sure it works here, right? That's the most important thing, because it really doesn't matter if an RCT says it works if it doesn't work for your kids. So I think, you know, Sho was mentioning earlier the idea of doing action research or something like that, or an A/B analysis comparing two different schools. Is this, whatever the intervention might be, is it working for us? That's my, I'll let Carol and Sho jump in and bail me out too.
I'll just say we've had really great experiences in some of our networks and working with teams of teachers and just sharing a particular study and then giving them time to read and discuss and then really purposefully talk about its relevance and application to their teaching or their teams, and really give them, you know, just a chance to say yay or nay, or this doesn't apply, or I don't understand how this worked, or it would never work, or we're not, you know, resourced this way. But it's a small, maybe a small scale way to do it, but it's been pretty successful and interesting. So.
Yeah, this is such a great question. I mean, this actually probably is one of the things that we tackle when we look at the whole standards thing too. I will say, if we leave the, you know, put this on the teachers, that is too much of a burden. There's just so much information and so many things to consider. It's true, we want teachers to be good consumers of research and action researchers, but all that said, there needs to be more of a, when we talked about resources, part of the standards and part of the support and leadership, those are the things that we should not, as teachers, always to be the ones to figure this out. That's why ends up teachers going into their classrooms, you know, going to Pinterest and Google to look for their materials. And so the systems we have seen in research that worked, and then maybe to some extent in the US, but in many ways in many other high performing systems, is you have this hierarchy of support where this whole collaborative inquiry mechanism actually doesn't exist just for teachers. It doesn't just exist within schools. It's across schools, across districts, across, you know, states or provinces, where then you have people who are experts of looking at what works, you know, under certain conditions, and then be responsible to diffuse these kind of innovations or things, models, and have these laboratory settings to constantly test different models where they may be one district. So you have all the master teachers together to test out certain things. And then if you have a top-down mandate, there's actually a group of experts to test this out first before you actually ask the teachers to try to figure this out. They're also the ones to look at bottom-up needs identified by teachers when they have these small, inquiry cycles, but they identify what they don't have, what they need. Then what happens next? Instead of expecting teachers to figure out what the resources are, next step is then there's actually support coming down. And so I think that's something that I'm hoping that by having professional standards as a system level, part of the document talked about how policies impact practice. It's then that would drive that kind of push at the system level to provide that expertise and also support for teachers.
Yeah, excellent point. It shouldn't rest on the shoulders of teachers at this point. It should be a systemic priority. Carol?
I agree with my colleagues on the panel. I mean, what I would say is, if you're looking for research or evidence, start with a very clearly defined problem of practice, or a question or a wondering. So I'm a full-time academic and I cannot keep up with the research, and it's my job to keep up with the research. So I certainly support what's been said about expecting people working in schools who've got extremely busy professional lives to be able to keep up with everything. It is unrealistic. Now, some of you will be doing graduate studies or reading in your professional and personal time. But try and get, a clear, specific problem of practice before you start. Because if your question is too big, it just becomes impossible. So that problem of practice is the key thing. Like Brian, I personally do start with existing literature reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, because they give you a good overview of whatever the current evidence is. So the What Works Clearinghouse, in the UK, they have the Education Endowment Foundation, who also produce nice, rapid summaries. So during COVID-19, they've already produced summaries about learning loss, remote learning. So places where you can get a sort of quick overview. From that, you'll begin to see some key research or some key names. So there may be some areas you want to dig deeper into. But I also agree, evidence from your school context, your district, Learning Forward have great resources. So I would say look out to people who can help you with the evidence rather than trying to keep up with the entire field, and look for places where it's already been summarized. Then if you want to go deeper, absolutely go deeper.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. That's great. And I'm seeing some comments in the chat box about how it's the responsibility of the district to curate the resources and sort of point people to emphasize the importance of this as an input or as an opportunity to learn, but then provide guidance and curated resources to help everyone who has so much on their plates engage in this, because it can be a fun learning experience. Okay, I think we are almost out of time, unfortunately. I'm going to ask you all to just provide one final wrap-up comment, if you would. And while you're thinking of your final wrap-up comment, I'm going to answer another question in the chat box. Someone asked about, will there be a matrix or rubric to measure the standards? And yes, there will be. That is part of our next phase of writing and work, and there will be a work team focused on developing the IC maps, or what are currently the IC maps for this current version of the standards, as well as some utilization and impact measures. So that's sort of the next, now that we have the standards written and under review, that'll be where we turn our attention next. So that'll be forthcoming, and it will all be released as a package in January 2022. So thanks for that question. That was a good one. Now I'll just ask you for a final word, if you would.
Well, I'm going to build on something I just heard Carol say, which also triggered something for me, and then she can go after me. So this idea of problem practice, I think being really clear about what problem you're trying to solve. Tony Bright was talking this morning, got me thinking, but he talks about avoiding solutionitis, right? Don't just jump to like, oh, here's the package, here's the program, but really understanding what you're trying to solve. And then you could look at the research and say, okay, what's the best approach we think for addressing this problem in our system? And then you can build your causal chain, your logic model out from there. So I think that problem of practice question is so important, and not just think, oh, we're going to go adopt a program. But what problem are you trying to solve? So Carol, again, expressed it better than I did, but that would be my parting thought. So.
Yeah, so I will build on Brian's comment. I mean, obviously, the concept of what works does matter, and Jo built on it earlier, I think, saying what works under what conditions for whom. But that why question too, what matters? So for your students, your classroom, your school, your community. We also absolutely know by 2020 that the work of the education profession is crucial. There's substantial evidence on that, and that professional learning is essential to developing and supporting educational improvement. So I would really say, please, if you have the time, look at the revised professional standards. I've been talking about the research, but research has to be combined with professional judgment and expertise and experience to make the work applied, as we've all been discussing. So I encourage you to take a look.
Well, I don't have too much to add. I definitely think I am just enjoying reading also the comments coming in the chat room too. Problem of practice, cycle of inquiry. Problem of practice, it comes from the situated learning theory of community of practice, and a community of practice is where when you have not only expertise, the domain expertise, but also you focus on the practice issues in practice. So the only thing I want to add is the beauty of learning from your peers, which is what I'm gaining from this conversation. I think folks, by participating in Learning Forward's conference too, is there's so much you can leverage and learn from just working with your peers and this collective wisdom that you could have. And also you can identify what you actually don't have as a group, then you go to the next level, which is, I see this being practiced here, and then it's just such a joy. And I look forward to having this conversation more.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to get to work with all of you. And I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experiences and perspectives with all of us today. We really appreciate your input, your engagement with the standards process and this panel today. Thanks very much. And I'll turn it back over to Tracy.
All right, and I invite folks to turn their cameras back on and bring your faces into the room if that's what you want to do. It's great to know you're with us. And thanks so much to the panel for that rich discussion and really sort of provoking us to think about how we use research in this process. And I know it's wonderful fodder for the standards team as we think about where we take this the next step. So I'll bring the slide back up, and I think you can see you can see that diagram of the 10 standards in the graphic in the system. And actually, so somebody put Kim, you put the perfect question in the chat box about where do you start with standards? Do you address all 10 at once, or do you enter through the problem of practice? And we talk about this as a system and that you don't pick one standard. And I think you're right. You come to professional learning because you have a particular, you see something in your data, you see something happening in your system, and you say, how are we going to tackle this? And how are we going to build the capacity of our educators, our teachers, our leaders to be in a position to address the problem that we see happening? It's probably more than one problem. But, and so then as you think about that, it's, you know, you don't build a whole system from the ground up, but you look at your piece of it and where do you enter it? So maybe you're entering it through new curriculum materials. And so maybe that is the first standard you look at. And then maybe you realize, wow, we need to know more about our data. And so you build your educators' capacity and your own capacity to use and look at evidence. Or, you know, then you think about, well, gosh, what does the learning need to look like for our educators? And I think entering that wherever you enter this, you know, it looks like a merry-go-round up there at this moment as I think about it. And you get on where you need to get on. You catch the horse that's in front of you, but then you recognize, wow, as I go toward the center, I'm really going to need to think about the leadership conditions in our system. And so I think everybody's going to come into this from their own perspective, and it depends in some cases, not just on your problem, but on your role, your positional authority, the resources you have available to you. So it's going to look different for everybody. So I want to talk just a little bit about the 10 standards in that system that's in front of us. And so you see, we've put those in a frame of 3 categories. If you are familiar with the 2001 standards, we had a frame around those of context, process, content. And this really does echo that. When we look at the conditions for success frame, we're really looking at what's the context in which learning happens and the conditions critical to success. And I really appreciated the conversation from our panelists about that culture of collaborative inquiry and why that isn't learning communities. And I think they explored that pretty deeply, but just looking at how that is, you know, that's both process and context, and it's part of the whole system. So that sits there, as does the leadership standard and the resources that are provided, as well as the equity foundation standard. And you'll see an equity standard in each category of the frame we've put up there. So that conditions is really the learning context, whereas in the green, we have our processes, transformational processes, and this is looking at the how of educator learning and how do we design the learning so that educators are meeting the outcomes and the goals they've set, and what does implementation look like so learning is sustained over time. And then in the orange slice of the merry-go-round, the content with the what of the learning, rigorous and inclusive content. And so that's where you see the curriculum assessment and instruction standard, as well as reaching each student. That's where we really hit the equity aspects of the what of educator learning. So I'm just going to show the 10 standards here. Those were named on the previous screen, but as we talked about conditions for success, I want to touch on a couple here. The equity foundations. And so that's where we really look at the whole context level and what's the vision for equitable learning for a whole system that looks at not just each student having the opportunity and access to high quality learning, but each educator having access to high quality professional learning. And what's that culture need to look like? Leadership, we know how important leadership is to professional learning. And I just want to point out that this is not just role specific. This is not about superintendents only or directors of professional learning or chief academic officers. This is educators in any role have a responsibility for sustaining a vision, establishing a vision, advocating for learning for others. And we know that folks in different roles have different responsibilities, access to resources, and power to build systems, but it really comes from leadership from everybody in a system. And then resources, of course, money, people, time, so critical. And that is part of the essential conditions, and also a huge equity foundation, because how you allocate resources across the system really determines the kinds of professional learning that educators will get to experience. And then when we look at the processes, we have these 4 standards here. Our equity process standard is called drivers. And how is it that we support educators so that they have the capacity? And when we say capacity, we're looking not just at knowledge, but also skills, beliefs, mindsets, to really work collaboratively with diverse colleagues and to continue to have the really difficult and ongoing, ever-changing conversations about equity and addressing barriers, addressing the kinds of white supremacy and racist structures that are built into school systems. So really looking at that throughout the professional learning system. Evidence, that's the data and, well, the research that we use to guide and plan professional learning as well as evaluate its impact. And then when we look at both learning designs and implementation, really looking at the experience of learning. And not only do educators use evidence they set their goals, but then they look at the content and the desired outcomes of their learning to say, okay, here's what learning needs to look like for educators if this is the kind of learning we're looking at for students. And when we think about an inquiry learning experience for students, how do we make sure that our educators have the opportunity to experience that same kind of learning? Because maybe that's the kind of learning they've never experienced. And why shouldn't their professional learning look exactly like what we want them to do with students? Implementation is really looking at change over time and sustaining, scaling, and making sure that educators have the support over the long haul, because we know the kind of time this takes. And then finally, the 2 content standards, so curriculum assessment and instruction. A lot of the research and evidence has been around high quality curriculum and instructional materials. And so this standard really does address that and what that means for professional learning. And then looking at reaching each student, how do we make sure that educators have the capacity to really teach and reach the students in their classrooms, to see all aspects of their identity as assets that they can recognize and represent and teach to. So that's where that comes in. So that's our body of standards, draft standards. And now just a look at this is just an example standard, and it's the one we heard about the most already today, but what's included for each standard, and you'll see this for each of the 10. So there's the statement of the standard itself. And you see in this graphic here, it's almost like a little navigational aid. So that little blue card there represents where you are in the system. So the culture of collaborative inquiry, the statement of the standard itself. And then for each, there are 3 key components. And this is very much like the 2011 standards, where we write a narrative of each of 3 components. And we make the educator very active throughout these standards. A lot of our sentences start with the word educators and the actions they take to create and engage in high quality professional learning. So you'll see information about the components as well as resources and references. And then we follow that with the essential actions that educators take. These are aligned with what you see described across the 3 components. And this is not an exhaustive list. You'll see much more around the actions educators take and the implementation tools, but we really want to move toward an action implementation orientation, even at the standards document itself. And these are also here. This is role agnostic and pretty much at a high level. And then in the implementation guides, we get more specific about what those in different roles do to bring the standards to life. And finally, for each standard, we've offered a rather comprehensive vignette that really focuses on this particular standard. And also this is where you see that that this standard is in a system. It's really impossible for us to write about one standard and not be mentioning others and the connections to others. Because in your culture of collaborative inquiry, the role of leaders and leadership is so critical. And the role of the content that educators are learning has to come in. So you'll see that across the 10 standards, which also gives us an opportunity to talk about what learning looks like in a range of learning contexts, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, and also the roles in the system, as well as the roles of the educators. So that gives us an opportunity to kind of look at the full system from a variety of perspectives. So that's what you will see in standards. And so we've shared a lot of information just in the last few minutes as I showed the standards. And I'm going to share in the chat box a link to a Padlet. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to use a Padlet yet, but as we do our learning virtually, it's great to have some of these tools where we can do the, it'd be great if we were together in a room. We'd give you all colored Post-its and markers, and we'd say, let's have a quick reflection activity on what you're seeing. And so I've put a link in the chat box and would love to have y'all click on that, and 3 questions will come up. And if you haven't had an opportunity to use one of these yet, it's a sticky wall, and you'll see the questions there, and then you'll see a plus sign, and it'll open up your own Post-it and just give your quick responses to those questions about what are you appreciating, and what are your questions, and what are your concerns. So we'll take just a couple minutes to do that, and really appreciate that. And I did put in the chat box earlier, but I'm recognizing I should do that again. We have so many ways we want to get feedback from you, but I'm putting a link to where we've posted the revision document. I think that maybe some of you have already downloaded those, and really appreciate that. There's also a link to a SurveyMonkey where we'll be asking for a lot of feedback, and recognizing the degree to which you may be able to do that. There could be a lot more. You may not have as much time, but we would love any feedback as you have a chance to dig into these deeply. And our deadline for that is January 15th. So we really appreciate it. And so thanks for putting comments in I'm gonna take a look at what you're saying in there. So awesome. And I love this question about what we hope to accomplish from adding the equity piece to each category. And so really part of it's a couple of elements there. One is recognizing that equity lives throughout a system. And when we said, okay, we know we're going to add an equity standard. And we said, is that a condition? Well, yeah, it is a condition. So we'll put it in the condition category. And then we said, wait a minute, it's really about the learning design as well. It's about our processes. Well, no, so we'll put it there. And so you see the quandary. And, we know it's also about what educators need to learn. And it's also that we really feel so deeply this moral responsibility to amplify equity at a high level. And we also know the feedback we get may say that this doesn't help you accomplish what you need to accomplish in your equity goals. And we welcome your feedback on how we've chosen to structure that. So love that question. And so thanks so much for the ideas you're putting there. We really appreciate that. And I am going to ask Elizabeth, we're coming close to the end of our time together. Elizabeth is going to talk just a little bit about our timeline. And so I'll go to the next slide.
Great, thank you. Yes, okay, so there, as Tracy said, we are in we have just, I love this, we can check it off the to-do list. We've released the first draft of the revised standards, yay, and we're looking forward to your feedback. And as we've said throughout, we want all of your feedback. We appreciate your participation and your deep engagement, even already with the draft that we've just released. We have a survey out there. We will collect feedback until January 15th, at which point we will begin the next revision of the standards, the revision of the standards. In March 2021, this period between releasing the standards and getting feedback will be an opportunity for us to turn to the development of the implementation tools, which you've heard a little bit about today, the IC maps and other types of policy adoption and adaption tools. And we're really looking forward to digging into that next. As you'll see, May 2021 is our target date for the next revision, along with the first draft of the tools. And we will do some school and district testing of the tools, the implementation and support tools we'll be developing. And at that same time, we'll be having conversations about how to support teams who are making adaptations to their existing work with our current set of standards. Again, continued tool development and refinement, leading up to release of the standards, the resources, and the implementation and tracking tools. Tracking isn't quite the word I want to use there, but sort of the monitoring use of the standards and the resources and the tools. And all of that will be released in March of 2022, which will come faster than it looks like it will on this slide. But we're really looking forward to that. And again, any input you can provide at this point will be helpful, and we'll be putting together the teams that will work on further writing and revision and tool development over the next couple of months. So we'll keep you all posted on our progress there as well. Did I cover it all, Tracy?
You did. And actually, Kim has a great question and so we're not going to release until early 2022, and the standards we have now are the standards. And we recognize that in bringing folks in this early to help shape what new standards become, it makes us a little impatient too. We want to have these. And so we're not going to say you can't use them. They're not the standards. They're not really to be shared as finalized standards. At the same time, what you learn through this process with us and how that helps you expand and deepen what you do with the 2011 standards, we certainly invite that. And we invite, as you think in those ways, to let us know, like, wow, as you really expand your thinking around, for example, the learning community standard, and you look at where it's headed, like, what does that mean for you in terms of the kind of implementation support you need and that sort of thing. So I really appreciate that question. And I think it's going to be kind of a tricky balancing act for us over time, because we do want to be transparent so that we get as much input as possible. So thanks for raising that. And Denise, I know we're headed off. Please send us on our way.
Thank you. And I want to thank all of you. What an incredible panel. And we're so glad that you were here to share with us today. And I hope that all of you experience this session as a sort of mini exemplar of really learning together, starting with a goal or a problem, which is revising the standards, and a problem of practice, and updating the standards and revising and really thinking about what's most important, reading and engaging in a great deal of research, bringing the experts together, being transparent with our thinking as soon as we can and getting the feedback about it, developing tools for implementation and ways of measuring progress so that we can determine impact. So it's, we're trying to, again, walk our talk, and we hope that you've experienced this learning together, because we're learning as much from all of you as you're learning, and can't thank you enough for engaging with us very deeply. All right. I think this is it. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you. And we look forward to next
Thank
time.
you.
And the advisory panel will be seeing, our committee will be seeing you again soon. And everyone
Thank you.
will hear from us continually. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you for
Kim.
answering my questions.
No, you asked such good questions. Thank you for doing that. That was helpful.
Yeah, our Colorado turnaround rubric is very aligned to the new standards rubric. So it's good and affirms up me and the work that I'm doing. So even though I can't really use it yet,
Yeah.
it is all aligned in our district turnaround rubric that we're using.
Oh, that's
Fantastic.
good to know. Yeah, we'd love to have a
Yes.
conversation with you as we're.
I was trying to put.
You may want to pilot and do some work with us on that.
Well, I tried to put the link in the Padlet. I still might. Would you like the link to that Colorado turnaround rubric in the Padlet?
Yeah,
That would be
absolutely.
great.
And if you can't, or my email is just elizabeth.foster@learningforward. If you want to send it to me, that would be good too. If the Padlet, I don't know how long the Padlet stays open.
I have it open, so I'll
Okay.
dump the Colorado turnaround rubric in the Padlet. I don't know what research or what all it says is Colorado turnaround rubric, and I couldn't find like who built it or where it came from, but that's the rubric that I'm using to align in the